Redshift here, doing my part to shift perceptions out of the pink and into the red. Okay, in today's video I'm going to be reading Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, or rather I'm going to be reading excerpts from it. So this is a classic book from 1946. Everybody really needs to read this. I mean, this really is the indispensable book on basic economics. Why price controls are bad and don't work, why, let me list the chapters here. This might give you an idea, what it's basically about. The fetish of full unemployment, who's protected by tariffs, the drive for exports, quote, parity prices, saving the X industry, how the price system works, stabilizing commodities, stabilizing being in quotes, just like protected in the who's protected by tariffs is in quotes. Government price fixing, what rent control does, minimum wage laws, do unions really raise wages enough to buy back the product, the function of profits, the mirage of inflation, the assault on saving, the lesson restated. Public works means taxes, taxes discourage production, credit diverts production, the curse of machinery. He talks about how machinery makes us more productive. It doesn't, and there's not a limited amount of work in the country. When people work, it creates more work. So this is important to understand. Also, tariffs are a bad thing, and he explains why. Minimum wage laws are a bad thing, and he explains why. Basically, a lot of the stuff, unions, they're good in the beginning, he talks about, but then now they go way too far. So he really debunks all the stuff that, you hear all the time about, politicians and different people acting like unions are a good thing, we need more unionization, or, we need to raise the minimum wage, or we need a living wage, or whatever. That stuff is not stuff that the government can do, because the government is the problem. Over-regulation and over-taxation and stuff. This is what causes all the problems. The only way government can fix the problem is to get the fuck out of the way by shrinking by 90%. If government cut taxes by 99% and got rid of 99% of the laws, then yeah, in that sense government can make things better, but not in any kind of we're going to raise the minimum wage. Now it's against the law to pay less than this, or we're going to do this, or we're going to do that. We're going to price control. We're going to save whatever X industry, whatever the industry is, and we're going to subsidize this or whatever. This kind of stuff is just totally counterproductive. It doesn't work at all, and even when it does work, usually a very heavy price is paid for doing it. A price way heavier than if they had just not done anything. So you really have to read this book by Henry Hazlitt called Economics in One Lesson. And then the subtitle of it is The Shortest and Surest Way to Understand Basic Economics. It's really good. So I'm going to be reading pages from that and then maybe commenting on the parts that I thought were useful or whatever. This page says... let's see here. It is precisely out of these extra profits that the subsequent social gains must come. The manufacturer must use these extra profits in at least one of three ways, and probably he will use part of them in all three. Number one, he'll use the extra profits to expand his operation by buying more machines to make more coats, or number two, he will invest the extra profits in some other industry, or number three, he will spend the extra profits on increasing his own consumption. Whichever of these three courses he takes, he will increase employment. In other words, the manufacturer, as a result of his as a result of his economies, I think they mean as a result of being, frugal or whatever, has profits that he did not have before. Every dollar of the amount he has saved in direct wages to former coat makers, he now has to pay out in indirect wages to the makers of the new machine, or to the workers in another capital-using industry, or to the makers of a new house or car for himself, or for jewelry and furs for his wife. In any case, unless he is a pointless hoarder, he gives indirectly as many jobs as he ceased to give directly. If I remember correctly, this was in the part where they were talking about like how saving is a good thing. I think it is. I could be wrong. Or maybe he was referring to the earlier part in the book. I read it out of order, so I can't really remember, but the book, I read it, in a haphazard way. But yeah, at some point in the book, he talks about saving, about how you always hear that, like, saving is bad, or they act like it's bad, or the politicians or corporations act like saving is bad or whatever, but that's not true at all. And most people are not pointless hoarders. And businesses, like you said, will churn the money back into their business in order to grow it even more, or they'll spend more money on their kids or their wife or whatever, thus, making other businesses more profitable and therefore employing more people. So it's not as if saving is bad. Saving is actually good. So yeah, and then he says, but the matter does not and cannot rest at this stage. If this enterprising manufacturer affects great economies as compared with his competitors, and again, I think, this is the problem with a book written in the 1940s. He uses words and phrases that are like rarely used these days, So when he says economies, I think he means ways of being frugal. I think that's what he means. So he says, when he affects great economies as compared with his competitors, either he will begin to expand his operations at their expense, or they will start buying the machines too. Oh yeah, this is the chapter where they're talking about like how machines do not take jobs, right? They're acting like people. Now this is not really true today, because back then you still needed people to run the machines. Today you can do automation and just completely cut the worker out entirely. You see, but yes, it is true that even then there is more work that needs to be done on a higher level in a highly technological society, but that's work that you need a high IQ to do, hence the rising IQ and memory requirement for a middle-class job. So we can't raise IQs without genetic engineering or a breeding program, and genetic engineering's not here yet, hence the importance of a breeding program, even just to survive, to make sure your family line survives by making sure that your descendants can have jobs. Because soon there's going to be a ton of jobs that need filling, but hardly any people with IQs high enough to fill them, and a ton of people that need work, but no low IQ jobs for those people. So we're heading toward a double whammy. It's going to be really ugly in, like, I don't know, 10, 20, 30, 40 years when this crunch happens with tons of unemployed and tons of jobs that need to be filled, but the people that are unemployed can't do those jobs, due to their, bad genetics, low IQs, and bad memories. And when I say low, I mean anything below like 110, 115 is a low IQ. Too low to have a job, But anyway, yeah, so he's saying, either the person who uses machines back, when machines still needed people to run them and stuff, either the person who uses machines will, profit at his competitor's expense if they don't use machines, and then he'll take market share, or they'll start using machines too. And if they use machines too, then the competition and production will also begin to force down the price of overcoats. There will no longer be as great profits for those who adopt the new machines, because everyone will be using the new machines. It'll be the new norm now, and now you don't get to sell the coats for as much as before, but make them for cheaper. Now everybody's making them for cheaper, so now everybody's competing. All the companies that make them are, and now everybody has to sell the coats for less, so the price comes down. You see. It says there will no longer be as great profits for those who adopt the new machines. The rate of profit of the manufacturers using the new machine will begin to drop, while the manufacturers who have still not adopted the machine may now make no profit at all. The savings, in other words, will begin to be passed along to the buyers of overcoats, to the consumers. But as overcoats are now cheaper, more people will buy them. This means that though it takes fewer people to make the same number of overcoats as before, more overcoats are now being made than before. If the demand for overcoats is what economists call elastic, that is, if a fall in the price of overcoats causes a larger total amount of money to be spent on overcoats than previously, then more people may be employed even in making overcoats than before the new labor-saving machine was introduced. We have already seen how this actually happened historically with stockings and other textiles. But the new employment does not depend on the elasticity of demand for the particular product involved. Suppose that, though the price of overcoats is almost cut in half, from a former price of, let's say, $150 to a new price of $100, not a single additional coat was sold, let's say. The result would be that while consumers were as well provided with new overcoats as before, each buyer would now have $50 left over that he would not have had left over before. He will therefore spend this $50 for something else, and so provide increased employment in other lines. He'll buy, more shoes or whatever, more lumber for, building more houses or whatever. He'll buy that, spend that $50 on other things, and then increased employment will happen, in other fields at other companies, right? In brief, on net balance, machines, technological improvements, automation, economies, and efficiency do not throw men out of work. But again, as I said before, this presumes that people's IQs are rising and are rising fast enough to keep up with the speed of technological development, which they no longer are. IQs have been going down for the last, 200 years or so, maybe 250, maybe 300. For a long time, they've been going down. If you want to know exactly how long, you can look at the charts in the book At Our Wits' End by Edward Dutton and Michael A. Woodley. Yeah, that's why you have to do a breeding program, especially since genetic engineering is not here yet. Okay, and then a page or two later, he says, but such facts and their modern, and again, each page I read is not necessarily related to the pages before it. You know what I mean? Could be talking about a different subject. But it says, but such facts and their modern counterparts have led some writers to the opposite extreme of looking only at the immediate effects on certain groups. Joe Smith is thrown out of a job by the introduction of some new machine. Keep your eye on Joe Smith, these writers insist. Never lose track of Joe Smith. But what they then proceed to do is to keep their eyes only on Joe Smith, and to forget Tom Jones, who has just got a new job in making the new machine, and Ted Brown, who's just got a job operating one, and Daisy Miller, who can now buy a coat for half of what it used to cost her. And because they think only of Joe Smith, they end up advocating reactionary and nonsensical policies, such as, technology takes away jobs, we can't have technology, And then a couple pages later, the book says, it is true that a few persons can profit at the expense of the rest of us from this minute, arbitrary subdivision of labor. Right, he's talking about how unions have gone overboard, and there's these, they've made it so that quote, each separate operation on the railroad, and this is described by somebody else, or is it maybe as a board? All right, it says yada yada yada. I'll just read the whole page. Basically, in a statement prepared by the American Railroads for the Attorney General's Committee on Administrative Procedure, the roads gave innumerable examples in which the National Railroad Adjustment Board had decided that, quote, each separate operation on the railroad, no matter how minute, such as talking over telephone or spiking or unspiking a switch, is so far an exclusive property of a particular class of employee that if an employee of another class, in the course of his regular duties, performs such operations, he must not only be paid an extra day's wages for doing so, but at the same time, the furloughed or unemployed members of the class held to be entitled to perform the operation must be paid a day's wages for not having been called upon to perform it, unquote. And then the book goes on to say, the book was quoting something else, which is why I say quote unquote, but I'm still quoting the book. And then the book goes on to say, it is true that a few persons can profit at the expense of the rest of us from this minute, arbitrary subdivision of labor, provided it happens in their case alone. But those who support it as a general practice fail to see that it always raises production costs, that it results on net balance in less work done and in fewer goods produced. The householder who is forced to employ 2 men to do the work of one has, it is true, given employment to 1 extra man. But he has just that much less money left over to spend on something that would employ somebody else, right? Because his bathroom leak has been repaired at double what it should cost because of him having to hire 2 people to do what one person could have done because of, arbitrary subdivision of labor and stuff and laws and rules and stuff forced on companies by unions and shit like this, then this means that, where was I? It says, but he has just that much money left over to spend on something else that would employ somebody else. Because his bathroom leak has been repaired at double what it should have cost, he decides not to buy the new sweater that he wanted, for example. Labor is no better off because a day's employment of an unneeded tile setter has meant a day's disemployment of a sweater knitter or a machine handler. because less sweaters are being sold, because of the guy having to fix his leak at twice the cost can't buy the extra sweater now. You see? So, then those people are worse off, because they don't have a job. And the householder is worse off because, instead of having repaired a shower and having bought a sweater, he has the shower and no sweater. And if we count the sweater as part of the national wealth, the country is short one sweater. This symbolizes the net result of the effort to make extra work by arbitrary subdivision of labor. But there are other schemes for spreading the work. Oh yeah, I didn't highlight that part. Just that last line there. This symbolizes the net result of the country to make extra work by arbitrary subdivision of labor. And that's a bad thing, as he just illustrated. Right? Anything the government tries to do pretty much is fucking things up, making things less efficient, etc. And then a couple pages later, it says, the result of the higher wage rate, therefore, will be much greater employment than before. The least efficient firms will be thrown out of business, and the least efficient workers will be thrown out of jobs. Production will be reduced all around the circle. Higher production costs and scarcer supplies will tend to raise prices so that workers can buy less with the same dollar wages. On the other hand, the increased unemployment will shrink demand. The increased unemployment will shrink demand and hence tend to lower prices. What ultimately happens to the prices of goods will depend upon what monetary policies are then followed. But if a policy of monetary inflation is pursued to enable prices to rise so that the hourly wages can be paid, this will merely be a disguised way of reducing real wage rates, so that they will return in terms of the amount of goods they can purchase to the same real rate as before. It doesn't matter how much you make every year. It matters how much your money can buy. So if prices are going up as fast or faster than you're getting raises at your job, you're not making more money. If you're getting a 5% raise every year and prices of everything else are going up 5% every year, you're making the exact same amount as before. And if prices are going up 5% every year and you're only making 3% more every year, you're actually making less money every year because you can buy less every year, you see? So then your wages in real terms, not nominal terms, but real terms, your wages are going down, right? The result would then be as if the working week had been reduced without an increase in hourly wage rates, and the results of that have already been discussed. So yeah, this is how it is, right? It really is that way. I think he was talking about work weeks, right? Like talking about how you should make the work week lower, right? Like make it a 40-hour work week instead of a 50-hour work week, or make it a 30-hour work week instead of a 40-hour work week. Yeah, well then everything is like reflexive. You know what I mean? Prices and things are reflexive, and then this applies to labor and everything too, right? So. Or if you increase wages, right? This means, greater unemployment because now the company only has so much money to spend on its workforce. So if it has to spend more money on its workforce, it will either have to go out of business or it'll have to fire some people. So when you make a minimum wage or something, or a union forces higher wages, like they're already way above the minimum wage, but the union forces the company to pay them even more, then the company has to fire some people. Has to lay off some people because, it can't afford to pay the higher wages because it doesn't make that much more profits. You know what I mean? Like corporations, now some of them make a huge profit and they do seem to be an almost endless source of money and they're not passing it along to the workers or anything. But like a lot of companies are not that way. Most companies are not that way. So if you try to dig into their profits, just like, greedy voters dig into the government's pockets by voting for welfare, then it's bad all the way around. Because like higher wages for some people means to pay for that, the corporation has to let some people go. So now there's more unemployed people, right? And then of course those unemployed people don't have extra money to, buy goods anymore. And then that makes it so that even more people are unemployed in other industries because less of other things are being sold. So, the thing that lowers standard of living is not wages being too low. It's costs of living being too high. Why are costs of living too high? Well, one of them is overregulation, making it so that you can't have cheaper apartments that are way smaller and different things like this. But also, Another thing is just high taxation. This massively cuts into people's ability to take care of themselves. You know what I mean? Like standard of living. You know what I mean? Like you can have two kids, but like, how are you going to take care of them? Taking care of your wife and your kids is not so fucking easy if taxes are very high. Like, think of how much easier you'd be able to take care of yourself, your family, your wife and your kids, and even your parents when they get older. Think of how much easier it would be if you were making 30% more money because of there being no taxes. People think the taxes are low, or like, oh, the poor, they don't even pay taxes. Get the fuck out of here. They absolutely pay taxes. They pay taxes in all kinds of other forms. They may not pay income tax, but they do pay other taxes. You know what I'm saying? Like, everybody pays taxes. Like, there's sales tax and there's tickets when you're supposedly going above the speed limit, even though a speed limit is a totally arbitrary thing. What if the government wanted to make the speed limit, like 20 on highways and, 5 miles an hour everywhere else, just so that everybody speeds so they can give tickets to everybody? That's just another form of taxation. You know what I'm saying? So you can't make excuses and say, oh, well, they were speeding. No. Fuck that. It's taxation. That is what it is. Tickets are taxation. Having to pay for a driver's license is taxation. You shouldn't even have to get a driver's license in the first place. You don't even actually. You can actually drive without a driver's license. You actually can. People do it. And they point out that the Supreme Court has decided that people have a right to travel. It's a basic human right to be able to travel. So you really don't need a driver's license, but they trick everybody into thinking that you do need one. But anyway, like, even if you're not paying income tax, or even if you're not paying property tax or whatever, it's like either you have a property, in which case you're paying property tax, or you're renting, in which case you're paying rent, and then you're a slave that way. It's like either way you're paying. You know what I mean? And then your rent that you're paying is income to the person who owns that apartment, and then they're paying taxes on that income, right? And everybody pays sales tax. I think, I can't remember, my state has sales tax. I'm not sure if every single state has sales tax, but every state that has sales tax, everybody in that state is paying sales tax, whenever they buy stuff. So this really is the case. It really, really is the case that, like, everybody would be living a much higher standard of living. Everybody would be able to take care of their loved ones much easier if they had higher wages by way of government spending less. Government taxes are because government spends too much. If government didn't exist, or were really, really tiny, so it spent very, 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 very little money, hardly anything, well, then this would be the case of, like, everybody getting to keep a much greater percentage of the income that they make. And then everybody would be living a much higher standard of living. You don't force companies. It's not a magic genie. You know what I'm saying? Like these corporations are not a magic. They're not a cookie jar that you can just, that's with an endless bottom that you can just endlessly take cookies out of. You can't just force the minimum wage to raise. You can't just always be raising the minimum wage or raising wages through unionization, striking and all that. You can't just endlessly raise wages like that, because you always have the government out there, stealing a huge portion of every transaction that people make. You know what I'm saying? So this massive stealing is the real problem, is the real source of poverty, is the real thing you got to get rid of if you want people to actually be more prosperous. Not forcing the company to pay higher wages, which therefore just results in them having to fire more people because they can't afford to employ as many people. You know what I'm saying? So it's just the way government acts is totally insane, and the way people act is totally insane. Like, people don't understand basic economics, so they're always supporting the politicians and all the insane shit that they do. And I think the politicians know what they're doing, and even if they don't, then they're idiots and they're incompetent and they shouldn't be in charge. Either they're evil, in which case they should not be in charge, or they're incompetent, and in which case they should not be in charge. Either way, there's no fucking reason to have politicians. And people are idiots. Like he says at the end of the book, like, things are getting better. There's signs things are getting better. But that was like in the 60s or 70s. It still has not gotten better. We're still saying, oh, well, Trump got into office. That's a sign that things might be getting better or whatever. No. False hope. False hope is the opium of the masses. You know what I mean? So you can't waste time in forming your own country. You have to form your own commune, no-go zone, or country. You have to. You have to do that. Because, that's the only way that you can not be under this bullshit. You know what I mean? Like having to pay high taxes, having to companies being forced to pay a minimum wage or whatever, over regulation, making it so that you can't build apartments in a certain way so that they're way more affordable, etc. So then you have, all these arbitrary costs and this thief called government stealing most of the money anyway, or at least a huge percentage of it. And then so yeah, people's standard of living is low. But then you try to fix it by government decree without fixing the actual fundamental problems like government spending. Well, the price reflexivity, the market just solves the problem by, forcing companies to fire more people when the companies are forced to raise wages by government decree. You know what I'm saying? So nothing gets better when government tries to quote unquote fix things by, just arbitrarily saying, oh no, you have to pay people more. Okay, where's the money going to come from? It's got to come from somewhere. So it comes from a place that, people don't like. That is by firing people, laying people off. So it's the only way to actually raise standard of living is to get rid of government. For real, it's the only way. Either get rid of it or radically change it, like overthrow it and start all over with a new libertarian government that spends hardly any money at all and has hardly any laws at all. That's like either a tiny government or no government is the only way to solve the problem. No matter how many laws, no matter how clever these laws are, it won't get around the free market. The free market always adjusts, and you end up paying for it in some other way if you try to solve the problem without fixing the true underlying problems like government spending. Then on another page he says, when after every great war it is proposed to demobilize the armed forces, there is always a great fear that there will not be enough jobs for these forces, and that in consequence they will be unemployed. It is true that when millions of men are suddenly released, it may require time for private industry to reabsorb them, though what has been chiefly remarkable in the past has been the speed, rather than the slowness, with which this was accomplished. The fears of unemployment arise because people look at only one side of the process. They see soldiers being turned loose on the labor market. Where's the purchasing power going to come from to employ them? If we assume that the public budget is being balanced, the answer is simple. The government will cease to support the soldiers, but the taxpayers will then be allowed to retain the funds that were previously taken from the taxpayers in order to support the soldiers, and then the taxpayers will have additional funds to buy additional goods. Civilian demand, in other words, will be increased and will give employment to the added labor force represented by the former soldiers. So, presumably when the war ends, taxation will go back down again. People will have more money to spend on, toasters and coats and movies and all kinds of stuff. And then the movie theaters and the toaster makers and, did I say toast? I think I meant to say toasters. Yeah, like, the thing that makes toast, right? Like, the companies that make toasters and, the movie theaters and everybody else, right? Like the overcoat makers and like all those companies will be making more money because everybody will have more money in their pocket and they'll be spending that money on things. And so all those companies will be able to hire more people, former soldiers, so then the soldiers will quickly be reabsorbed into the, the workforce without really any problems. Then a few pages later it says, the economic goal of any nation as of any individual the economic goal of any nation, as of any individual, is to get the greatest results with the least effort. The whole economic progress of mankind has consisted in getting more production with the same labor. It is for this reason that men began putting burdens on the backs of mules instead of on their own, that they went on to invent the wheel and the wagon, the railroad and the motor truck. It is for this reason that men used their ingenuity to develop 100,000 labor-saving inventions. All this is so elementary that one would blush to state it if it were not being constantly forgotten by those who coin and circulate the new slogans. Translated into national terms, this first principle means that our real objective is to maximize production. In doing so, full employment, that is the absence of involuntary idleness, becomes a necessary byproduct. But production is the end. Employment is merely the means. We cannot continuously have the fullest production without full employment, but we can very easily have full employment without full production, and that is a bad thing, right? And then he goes on to say, primitive tribes are naked and wretchedly fed and housed, but they do not suffer from unemployment. China and India are incomparably poorer than ourselves, but the main trouble from which they suffer is primitive production methods, which are both a cause and a consequence of a shortage of capital, and not unemployment. Nothing is easier to achieve than full employment, once it is divorced from the goal of full production and taken as an end in itself. World War II provided full employment for every nation involved. The slave labor of Germany had full employment. Prisons and chain gangs have full employment. Coercion can always provide full employment. So he's pointing out that like full employment is a stupid goal. And even if you get it, it doesn't mean they're productively employed. So it could be just make work. And then, nothing is being produced even though you're paying these people to so-called work. Like, the proverbial example of the guy, digging a ditch and then filling it back in again. Nothing good is created by that. So you may as well just hand him money for not working. You know what I mean? It's stupid. The goal should be increasing production, nothing else, because that's how you increase standard of living. And the goal now especially should not just be increase of production, but increase of technology, advancement of technology. That should be the real goal. And that is how you increase production, by advancing technology. That's the only way you raise standard of living, is by advancing technology. But of course, the reason a lot of people are poorer and standard of living seems to always be going down, or at least staying put, even though technology is constantly increasing, is number one, people are getting more and more cowardly and are thus allowing higher and higher levels of tyranny, and thus government is able to siphon more and more and more wealth and spend more and more money each year, therefore making it so that, standard of living never increases, even though technology is increasing, because government is stealing more and more and more of our money every year. And it's a situation of like, the population is also going up always. See, standard of living, if we had a government that could never take more than a certain percentage of our income, like if we had a government that was never ever going to take more than 5% of our income in any way, shape, or form, like everybody pays a 5% income tax no matter how rich or poor you are, including the guy on the street, like who gets donations, little coins dropped into his cup or whatever, like even those people have to pay the 5%. Everybody pays the 5%, no matter how it's done, whether it's a 5% sales tax or 5% income tax or whatever it is. So everybody pays 5%, right? If everybody does that, pays 5%, then and government can and never will take more than 5% of anybody's money, because there's only one form of taxation and it never goes above 5%. There's not all these different kinds of taxation, like tickets and income tax and sales tax and property tax and all this other bullshit. There's only one form of tax, like just income tax or just sales tax. There's just one form of tax, and it's only 5%. And if it could never go above that, and if we also were never having more than replacement levels of kids, that is, every couple, on average, between all the couples in the country had exactly 2 kids or less. Slightly less would be deflationary, and that would be fine if it were slight deflation, but severe deflation is bad. But slight deflation is good, just like, Bitcoin and gold. But, they're deflationary currencies, or deflationary monies, and therefore they're good, because they slightly increase in value every year. But anyway, like I was saying, like if you have no immigration, and you're breeding at replacement levels or lower on average, the whole country is, and government is never taking more than the same amount of your income every year, even decades and decades and decades later, they're still only taking 5%. Well, then it's a guarantee that standard of living would be going up. But because government is taking more and more and more of our money every year, and population is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, meaning land is more and more scarce, meaning the price of rent and housing and stuff is getting higher and higher and higher, this means that standard of living is, because of those forces, going down, even while technology is trying to increase standard of living. So, standard of living therefore seems to either be stuck or going down. Even though if we're breeding at replacement levels are lower and we're not allowing immigration, and we're limiting the growth of government, so the government was no longer growing, and preferably we shrunk government down to a tiny size and then kept it at that level. But even keeping government at a huge level, the huge monstrous size it is now, if we ceased to allow it to grow, if it were not allowed to grow any bigger, then eventually, if we were doing the thing of like not breeding more than replacement levels, and we were not allowing any immigration or anything, so that the population in the country was never increasing and was perhaps even slightly decreasing, well, then this would mean that it would be a situation of rent would not be becoming more expensive, etc. And then it'd be a situation of, standard of living would be going up, especially as technology became much, 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 much more advanced. Because then the size of government compared to the level of technological advancement and the prosperity that technological advancement gives would become smaller and smaller and smaller, even if government were still taking the same amount of everybody's income, a large amount of everybody's income, like 30%. It would still, standards of living would still be increasing, because it's not about how much government is taking from you. It's about whether they're taking more and more and more from you every year. And also the fact that, population is increasing, which also decreases standard of living year after year. So, yeah, I wanted to say that. Then it says, much later in the book, it says, in discussing this subject, there is no point in assuming a price control that would fix prices exactly where a free market would place them in any case. That would be the same as having no price control at all. We must assume that the purchasing power in the hands of the public is greater than the supply of goods available, and that prices are being held down by the government below the levels to which a free market would put them. Now, we cannot hold the price of any commodity below its market level without, in time, bringing about two consequences. The first is to increase the demand for that commodity. Because the commodity is cheaper, people are both tempted to buy and can afford to buy more of it. The second consequence is to reduce the supply of that commodity. Because people buy more, the accumulated supply is more quickly taken from the shelves of merchants. But in addition to this, production of that commodity is discouraged, because profit margins are lower because the price of it's being held down by the government, right? Such as with gold. Profit margins are reduced or wiped out. The marginal producers are driven out of business. Even the most efficient producers may be called upon to turn out their product at a loss. This happened in World War II when slaughterhouses were required by the Office of Price Administration to slaughter and process meat for less than the cost of them to cattle of cattle on the hoof and the labor of slaughter and processing. Right, so the government is forcing them to sell meat or slaughter and process meat for less than it was costing them to do so. If we did nothing else, therefore, the consequence of fixing a maximum price for a particular commodity would be to bring about a shortage of that commodity. But this is precisely the opposite of what the government regulators originally wanted to do. For it is the very commodities selected for maximum price fixing that the regulators most want to keep in abundant supply. But when they limit the wages and profits of those who make these commodities, without also limiting the wages and profits of those who make luxuries or semi-luxuries, they discourage the production of the price-controlled necessities, while they relatively stimulate the production of less essential goods. And I did not highlight it here, but I don't know, maybe I should read it. No, I won't read it. But yeah, he talks about, rationing. Like, he also talks about how, oh yeah, this is an important part. I don't know why I didn't highlight it. Yeah, I'll just read the whole thing. While they relatively stimulate the production of less essential goods. Some of these consequences in time become apparent to the regulators, who then adopt various other devices and controls in an attempt to avert them. Among these devices are rationing, cost control, subsidies, and universal price fixing. Let us look at each of them in turn. When it becomes obvious that a shortage of some commodity is developing as a result of a price fixed below the market, rich consumers are accused of taking more than their fair share. Or if it is a raw material that enters into manufacture, individual firms are accused of hoarding it. The government then adopts a set of rules concerning who shall have priority in buying the commodity, or to whom and in what quantities it shall be allocated, or how it shall be rationed. If a rationing system is adopted, it means that each consumer can have only a certain maximum supply, no matter how much he is willing to pay for more. If a rationing system is adopted, in brief, it means that the government adopts a double price system, or a dual currency system in which each consumer must have a certain number of coupons or points in addition to a given number of ordinary money, in addition to a given amount of ordinary money. In other words, the government tries to do through rationing part of the job that a free market would have done through prices. I say only part of the job because rationing merely limits the demand without also stimulating the supply, as a higher price would have done. The government may try to assure supply through extending its control over the cost of production of a commodity. To hold down the retail price of beef, for example, it may fix the wholesale price of beef, the slaughterhouse price of beef, the price of live cattle, the price of feed, the wages of farm hands. To hold down the delivered price of milk, it may try to fix the wages of milk truck drivers, the price of containers, the farm price of milk, the price of feedstuffs. To fix the price of bread, it may fix the wages in bakeries, the price of flour, the profits of millers, the price of wheat, and so on. But as the government extends this price fixing backwards, it extends at the same time the consequences that originally drove it to this course, assuming that it has the courage to fix these costs and is able to enforce its decisions. Then it merely in turn creates shortages of the various factors, labor, feedstuffs, wheat, or whatever, that enter into the production of the final commodities. Thus, the government is driven to controls in ever-widening circles, and the final consequence will be the same as that of universal price fixing. The government may try to meet this difficulty, but that assumes government competence in a certain way at all. Number one, that's pointless because of what he just pointed out, but even if it weren't pointless, the government's doing all this work for nothing, and the government usually fucks things up. So, the government's going to fuck up along the way, and that'll just make everything less efficient, which is something I want to add. But back to the book. The results will be the same as universal price fixing. The government may try to meet this difficulty through subsidies. It recognizes, for example, that when it keeps the price of milk or butter below the level of the market, or below the relative level at which it fixes other prices, a shortage may result because of lower wages or profit margins for the production of milk or butter as compared to the other commodities. Therefore, the government attempts to compensate for this by paying a subsidy to the milk and butter producers. Passing over the administrative difficulties in this, and assuming that the subsidy is just enough to ensure the desired relative production of milk and butter, it is clear that though the subsidy is paid to producers, those who are really being subsidized are the consumers. For the producers are on net balance getting no more for their milk and butter than if they had been allowed to charge the free market price in the first place. But the consumers are getting their milk and butter at a great deal below the free market price. They are being subsidized to the extent of the difference. That is, by the amount of subsidy paid ostensibly to the producers. Now, unless the subsidized commodity is also rationed, it is those with the most purchasing power that can buy most of it. This means that they are being subsidized more than those with less purchasing power. Who subsidizes the consumers will depend upon the incidence of taxation. But men in their role of taxpayers will be subsidizing themselves in their role of consumers. It becomes a little difficult to trace in this maze precisely who is subsidizing whom. What is forgotten is that subsidies are paid for by someone, and that no method has been discovered by which the community gets something for nothing. Well, my point. I will add technically that actually the way to get something for nothing is to increase technology and limit breeding. Limit breeding to replacement levels or lower, and limit government growth. Limit the growing expense of government, and increase technology. That's the way you get something for nothing. Rather, you're getting more for less until eventually you're getting some things for free. And then eventually, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years from now, everybody will get everything for free. But they'll still be working just for, desire to push technology forward even more. And they'll just keep working in order to, keep themselves busy, and curiosity and creativity and all that stuff. They'll keep working, but they won't have to, But, another page I wanted to read much farther on says, let's see here. True, inflation may sometimes correct them, but it is a heady and dangerous method. It makes its corrections not openly and honestly, but by the use of illusion. Inflation, indeed, throws a veil of illusion over every economic process. It confuses and deceives almost everyone, including even those who suffer by it. We are all accustomed to measuring our income and wealth in terms of money. The mental habit is so strong that even professional economists and statisticians cannot consistently break it. It is not easy to see relationships always in terms of real goods and real welfare. Who among us does not feel richer and prouder when he is told that our national income has doubled, in terms of dollars, of course, compared to some pre-inflationary period? Even the clerk who used to get $75 a week and now gets $120 a week thinks that he must be in some way better off, though it costs him twice as much to live as it did when he was getting $75. so therefore he's really little or no better off, or maybe he's even worse off, right? He's, of course, not blind to the rise in the cost of living, but neither is he as fully aware of his real position as he would have been if his cost of living had not changed, and if his money salary had been reduced to give him the same reduced purchasing power that he now has, in spite of his salary increase because of higher prices. Inflation is the autosuggestion, the hypnotism, the anesthetic that has dulled the pain of the operation for him. Inflation is the opium of the people. And this is precisely its political function. It is because inflation confuses everything that it is so consistently resorted to by our modern planned economy governments. We saw in Chapter 4, to take but one example, that the belief that public works necessarily create new jobs is false. If the money was raised by taxation, we saw, then for every dollar that the government spent on public works, one less dollar was spent by the taxpayers to meet their own wants. And for every public job created, one private job was destroyed. But suppose the public works are not paid for from the proceeds of taxation. Suppose they're paid for by deficit financing, that is, from the proceeds of government borrowing or from resorting to the printing press. Then the result just described does not seem to take place. The public works seem to be created out of new purchasing power. You cannot say that the purchasing power that has been taken away from the taxpayers. For the moment, the nation seems to have gotten something for nothing. And, of course, is not actually getting something for nothing. It just seems that way because inflation is one of those things that makes it seem like things are not as bad as they are, or like things are getting better when they're actually getting worse, because people don't do the calculation. If you want to really measure your income relative to last year, the year before, whatever, take the price of like a candy bar or something, and then take that price and see how many of those candy bars you can buy with your income every year. And then, 5 years later, look at the price of that same candy bar, look at what you're making now, and then see how many candy bars you can buy with that amount of yearly income that you make now, and see whether you're making more money or less money. Like, unless you're really like getting promotions and climbing up the scale, if you're just getting like small raises every year for doing the same job, you're probably making less money every year, not more money. And this is really important to understand. And then let's see here. Several pages later, it says, it is not even, let's see here, to the small extent that this may occur, it has already been reflected in the production plans of business and in the price level. It is not ordinarily even cumulative, dishoarding, as eccentric recluses die and their hoards are discovered and dissipated, probably offset new hoarding. In fact, the whole amount involved is probably insignificant in its effect on business activity. If money is kept either in savings banks or commercial banks, as we have already seen, the banks are eager to lend and invest it. They cannot afford to have idle funds. Probably mainly because if they have idle funds, they're losing money to inflation also, right? The only thing that will cause people generally to try to increase their holdings of cash, or that will cause banks to hold funds idle and lose the interest on them, is, as we have seen, either fear that prices of goods are going to fall, or the fear of banks that they will be taking too great a risk with their principal. But this means that principal being their, like initial money, their initial capital or whatever the word is. But this means that signs of a depression have already appeared and have caused the hoarding, rather than the hoarding having caused a depression. So hoarding doesn't cause depressions. Depressions cause hoarding. Apart from this negligible hoarding of cash then, and even this exception might be thought of as a direct investment in money itself, savings and investment are brought into equilibrium with each other in the same way that the supply of and demand for any commodity are brought into equilibrium. For we may define savings and investment as constituting respectively the supply of and demand for new capital. And just as the supply of and demand for any other commodity are equalized by price, so the supply of and demand for capital are equalized by interest rates. The interest rate is merely the special name for the price of loaned capital. It is a price like any other. This whole subject has been so appallingly confused in recent years by complicated sophistries and disastrous government policies based upon them that one almost despairs of getting back to common sense and sanity about it. There is a psychopathic fear of excessive interest rates. It is argued that if interest rates are too high, it will not be profitable for industry to borrow and invest in new plants and machines. This argument has been so effective that governments everywhere in recent decades have pursued artificial cheap money policies. But the argument, in its concern with increasing the demand for capital, overlooks the effect of these policies on the supply of capital. It's one more example of the fallacy of looking at the effects of a policy only on one group and forgetting the effects on another. And that's exactly why I oppose MGTOW, because it's extremely short-sighted and it only focuses on the benefits to the men who go MGTOW, and it doesn't look at the negative effects to the whole entire world or the whole country that happen as a result of these men going MGTOW. Same thing with the promiscuous men, you know. And when I say MGTOW men, I'm criticizing them like this. I'm talking about like they are being short-sighted and therefore destructive, and not caring about the country and not investing in the future, in terms of like getting freedom back and all this kind of stuff. And they're being very short-sighted, right? But on the other side of it, the promiscuity side of it, they're also being short-sighted and destructive. They're benefiting themselves at the expense of the morality of women and the ability of other men to find a woman who's not going to divorce rape him because she's a virgin. All these promiscuous men out there, they're going around taking women's virginity and stuff, and then those women can't pair bond, and then they divorce rape their husband. You know what I mean? Like they're looking at the benefits for their group, the MGTOWs are, and forgetting the effects that they're having on all the other groups, right? And predatory unsustainability like that is how the Wandering Tribe acts, and that's why all the people who are red-pilled about the JQ are, they have a serious problem with that, with the Wandering Tribe, because it acts in a way that benefits itself at the direct expense of everybody else. It parasitically and destructively feeds on everybody else to benefit itself. And that is how women are, and that is how MGTOW men are. And it's so ironic, therefore, that MGTOW criticizes women for being parasitic in this way when MGTOW men are being the exact same way. But I also wanted to say about interest rates, Volcker, Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve, I think he might have been forced by the market or by some other force to do it, so he doesn't get all the credit. Maybe he only gets a little bit of the credit, but he should get some of the credit, because I think he did it even though he didn't want to or something, but he did do it. Volcker did jack interest rates up in the 70s and thereby save the economy. But now we're so foolish we don't even do that anymore. Greenspan, Bernanke, Yellen, and the present guy, all of them should be jacking interest rates up to force the U.S. economy to, print up the money to pay its debt, dishonestly, like it's going to do eventually anyway. But, then it's forced to tighten its belt after that. Either get off debt-based money or whatever. Stop spending so much money, massively shrink the size of the government, whatever. So, you can force people to be more efficient by jacking interest rates up. So it's actually a good thing for business or for governments when interest rates are jacked up on them, and then that seems to be harmful to them because it forces them to start being responsible. They can no longer get away with their irresponsible behavior. So raising interest rates is a good thing, even though it may seem harmful. But lowering interest rates, even though it seems helpful to the economy, is actually very poisonous because it allows government and corporations and everybody else to not only malinvest, but to also waste a shitload of money. So that's important to understand. And let's see here. There's just a few pages left. The next one that I wanted to read several pages later says, "Now few people recognize the necessary implications of the economic statements they are constantly making. When they say that the way to economic salvation is to increase credit, it is just as if they said that the way to economic salvation is to increase debt. These are different names for the same thing seen from opposite sides. When they say that the way to prosperity is to increase farm prices, that is like saying that the way to prosperity is to make food dearer for the city worker. That is, more expensive for the city worker. When they say that the way to national wealth is to pay out government subsidies, they are in effect saying that the way to national wealth is to increase taxes. When they make it a main objective to increase exports, most of them do not realize that they necessarily make it a main objective ultimately to increase imports. When they say under nearly all conditions that the way to recovery is to increase wage rates, they have found only another way of saying that the way to recovery is to increase costs of production. It does not necessarily follow because each of these propositions, like a coin, has its reverse side, or because the equivalent proposition, or the other name for the remedy, sounds much less attractive, that the original proposal is under all conditions unsound. There may be times when an increase in debt is a minor consideration as against the gains achieved with the borrowed funds, when a government subsidy is unavoidable to achieve a certain military purpose, when a given industry can afford an increase in production costs, and so on. But we ought to make sure in each case that both sides of the coin have been considered, that all the implications of a proposal have been studied. This is seldom done. In other words, government is stupid. Government is always stupid, so even if there would be a way of doing this kind of thing, raising taxes or, increasing spending at certain times, decreasing at others, etc., by manipulation, you could do it intelligently, theoretically, and have it be better than just the free market doing whatever it's going to do. naturally without any interference. But government is always stupid, and so that never happens. And so the only way to do it is just to have things work in the country, is just to have government stay the hell out of everything. Like anarcho-capitalism is the ultimate example of that. Libertarianism is sort of close, but still, there's still a distortion of prices by way of war and certain laws, and preventing murder, which prevents people from enforcing morality, which makes it so that the prices of everything are distorted. Only anarcho-capitalism is true capitalism, and only anarcho-capitalism is true price discovery, true prosperity, true freedom, and therefore true price discovery of everything, including morality. So anarcho-capitalism is the only moral setup as well, because morality, like he was talking about interest rates are just another price. Well, morality is just another price. Like we are making the price for promiscuity and unnaturally high, and we are making the cost of promiscuity unnaturally low, rather, I should say. People pay less of a price for it than they should, and we are making the cost of being a moral person exceedingly high, way higher than it should be, by having a society like this. And this is all caused by, outlawing murder so that you can't use violence to get things back to sanity. You see, so the only way to have a moral populace, not just a free populace and a prosperous populace and fast technological development and all that, and true price discovery, but the only way to actually have morality is to have anarcho-capitalism. Because everything is a price, including morality. Human behavior is a price. Everything is a price. Sex has a price, love has a price, loyalty has a price, interest rates are a price, grain has a price, computers have a price. Everything has a price. Now, you can't necessarily put a price on it and sell it in a store, but it has what is in effect a price. And when you artificially change things by force, by way of government, even if it's only a tiny libertarian government, only having a few rules like outlawing murder and theft and rape, you're still messing with the prices of things. And you are still, therefore, distorting the free market and distorting morality as well, and making things less efficient and less moral. And let's see here, in another page, a few pages later, it says, "Now it is often not the diffused gain of the increased supply or new discovery that most forcibly strikes even the disinterested observer, but the concentrated loss. The fact that there is more and cheaper coffee for everyone in sight of what is seen is merely that some coffee growers cannot make a living at the lower price. The increased output of shoes at lower cost by the new machine is forgotten. What is seen is a group of men and women thrown out of work. It is altogether proper, it is in effect essential, it is in fact essential to a full understanding of the problem that the plight of these groups be recognized, that they be dealt with sympathetically, and that we try to see whether some of the gains from this specialized progress cannot be used to help the victims find a productive role elsewhere. But the solution is never to reduce supplies arbitrarily, to prevent further inventions or discoveries, or to support people for continuing to perform a service that has lost its value. Yet this is what the world has repeatedly sought to do by protective tariffs, by the destruction of machinery, by the burning of coffee, by 1,000 restriction schemes. This is the insane doctrine of wealth through scarcity. It is a doctrine that may always be privately true, unfortunately, for any particular group of producers considered in isolation. If they can make scarce the one thing that they have to sell while keeping abundant all the other things that they have to buy, that is, if they can keep everything else, the things that everybody else makes abundant, but make the thing that they sell scarce, then they can make more money and still pay low prices for everything else. So they're better off. But they're better off at the cost of everybody else. You see? So this is foolish, or at least, at the very least, inhumane, unfair. So let's see here. Yeah, they keep the thing that they want to make the thing that they sell scarce and make the thing that everybody else sells abundant, right? And therefore lower priced. But it is a doctrine that is always publicly false. It can never be applied all around the circle, for its application would mean economic suicide. And this is our lesson in its most generalized form. For many things that seem to be true when we concentrate on a single economic group or seem to be illusions when the interests of everyone, as consumers no less than as producer, are considered. To see the problem as a whole and not in fragments, that is the goal of economic science. and it's also a moral issue, and it's also an efficiency issue, because if everybody's trying to cheat like this, like I've talked about in previous videos, such as if everybody's a psycho, if everybody's lying, if everybody's trying to cheat, if everybody's trying to get an unfair advantage at the cost of everybody else, well then this is just unnecessary time and money and energy put into trying to cheat, instead of all that energy and effort being put into trying to produce, be creative, be more efficient, etc., work harder, and then less is produced, and then the standard of living is lower for everyone because of everybody trying to cheat, and then everybody is screwed over, right? Because when one group does it, then tries to raise the wages in their industry or make their product more scarce than it should be, well, so for their own advantage at the cost of everybody else, well then everybody else is going to try and do that too, and then when everybody's doing it, the production of the whole country is far less, and then everybody's living standard is lower, even if some groups are doing better in terms of like what they can extort from everybody else, because they're more successful at making their product scarce than everybody else is. But still, they're probably no better off than before, than if everybody were being honorable, because everybody in the country is worse off because of everybody trying to cheat like this. And then it says, one of the last few, there's like, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 pages left. And this page says, a few pages later, it says, the policy of inflation, as I've said, is partly imposed for its own sake. More than 40 years after the production of John Maynard Keynes's general theory, and more than 20 years after that book has been thoroughly discredited by analysis and experience, a great number of our politicians are still unceasingly recommending more deficit spending in order to cure or reduce existing unemployment. An appalling irony is that they are making these recommendations when the federal government has already been running a deficit for 41 out of the last 48 years, and when that deficit has been reaching dimensions of $50 billion a year. And even greater irony is that, not satisfied with following such disastrous policies at home, our officials have been scolding other countries, notably Germany and Japan, for not following these expansionary policies themselves. This reminds one of nothing so much as Aesop's fox, who, when he lost his tail, encouraged all of his other fellow foxes to cut off theirs. What? So, yeah, that really is true. That's how it is, man. Our government's insane. Or like he says elsewhere in the book, or no, it's in the New Case for Gold. Rickards says that our government, back in, I can't remember what it was, there have been several periods through, America the last 50 or 100 years when we've sold off a bunch of gold to keep the gold price low, to drive down the price of gold. But he said in one of those times, like, we started running out or whatever, or we stopped selling gold, and then we, from then on, just encouraged other countries to sell gold. Right? Like, we were fine with them selling gold. We encouraged them to sell gold, but we weren't going to do it ourselves. We didn't want to lose the rest of our gold, although I think we actually have been selling off our gold behind the scenes in secret. So, this is important to understand. It's the same principle, encouraging other people to do what you're doing just because what you're doing is stupid, and you don't want to be disadvantaged by having done the stupid thing, because if everybody does the stupid thing, then you all suffer equally, and then it's in certain senses, it evens out, and then none of you suffer, right? But let's see here. Then a few pages later it says, though when compared with the record of a year or two before, the overall record of world currency depreciations was more moderate. And then he lists all these different currencies and how much they went down. The dollar went down 6% or a year recently, and, well, this was, when he wrote the book in the 70s, or maybe this was in the 40s. Yeah, I think this is the last chapter, so this is probably the 70s or 60s when he was talking about this. The yen went down 91%, the krona went down 95%, the pound went down 14.5%, the lira went down 15.7%, and the Uruguayan currency went down 35.5%, the Chilean 53.9%, and the Argentinian currency went down 65.7% each year. So, he says, I leave it to the reader to picture the chaos these rates of depreciation of money were producing in the economies of these countries, and suffering the lives of the millions of their inhabitants. As I pointed out, these inflations, themselves the cause of so much human misery, were in turn, in large part, the consequence of other policies of government economic intervention. Practically all these interventions unintentionally illustrate and underline the basic lesson of this book. All were enacted on the assumption that they would confer some immediate benefit on some specific group. Those who enacted them failed to take heed of their secondary consequences, failed to consider what their effect would be in the long run on all groups. And since people seem just unwilling to see the truth, and they seem absolutely unwilling to hold government accountable, this means that this crap is just going to keep happening. It's going to keep happening. And the only way to protect yourself from that crap is to make sure that you cannot have your currency, your savings, inflated away. And the only way to make sure that doesn't happen is to either hold a cryptocurrency that is stable and holds its value, a good one like Monero, or maybe Bitcoin, although what's his name was saying, Bitcoin is maybe obsolete, but so many people use it and it's so much more valuable than any cryptocurrency. I'm not sure whether it's going away or not. It seems to be like gold, like seemingly replaceable, but yet at the same time, everybody stores their value in it, at least over long term, and so the value just stays super high. But whatever. What's his name was saying in an interview with Daniel Cambone recently, the guy McAfee. McAfee was saying, by the way, that guy's toxic, man. He is rude and vicious, and he's such an example of a toxic, billionaire or guy with hundreds of millions. I mean, goddamn, he was so fucking rude in the interview, he's just, and like in an unnecessary vicious way, not because she was being stupid or anything. He's just an asshole, more than I had ever noticed in any of his other interviews I've seen him in. But anyway, where was I going with that? Anyway, but basically, he was saying Monero. He gets paid in Monero alone now. You want to hire him for something, you got to pay him in Monero. He's saying there's all these superior coins that are better than Bitcoin. But anyway, like I was saying, you have to save your money in like gold, silver, or crypto or good cryptocurrency, because that's the only way to protect yourself against inflation. Otherwise, this bullshit the government is doing will inflate your money away, even though you're smart enough to realize that this is stupid, retarded crap that the government is doing, and we're paying for it with inflation. But, if you're smart enough to realize that, you should be smart enough to know to save in gold or silver or a cryptocurrency, and that way the government will not be able to inflate away your savings. It'll only be able to inflate away the savings of those who are stupid enough or unprincipled enough to save in cash or money in a bank or some other form that is not sound money, right? And then the next page or two later, he says, at the same time that they encourage more consumer spending, they pile up further disincentives and penalties in the way of saving and investment. Their chief method of doing this today, as we have already seen, is to embark on or accelerate inflation. The result is that today, for the first time in history, no nation is on a metallic standard, and practically every nation is swindling its own people by printing a chronically depreciating paper currency. To pile one more item on this heap, let us examine the recent tendency, not only in the United States but abroad, for almost every social program once launched upon to get completely out of hand. We have already glanced at the overall picture, but let us now look more closely at one outstanding example: Social Security in the U.S. The original Federal Social Security Act was passed in 1935. The theory behind it was that the greater part of the relief problem was that people did not save in their working years, and so when they were too old to work, they found themselves without resources. This problem could be solved, it was thought, if they were compelled to insure themselves, with employers also compelled to contribute half the necessary premiums so that they would have a pension sufficient to retire on at age 65 or over. Social Security was to be an entirely self-financed insurance plan based on strict actuarial principles. A reserve fund was to be set up sufficient to meet future claims and payments as they fell due. It never worked out that way. The reserve fund existed mainly on paper. The government spent the Social Security tax receipts as they came in, either to meet its ordinary expenses or to pay out benefits. Since 1975, current benefit payments have exceeded the system's tax receipts. It also turned out that in practically every session, Congress found ways to increase the benefits paid, broaden the coverage, and add new forms of social insurance. As one commentator pointed out in 1965, a few weeks after Medicare insurance was added, quote, Social Security sweeteners have been enacted in each of the past 7 general election years, unquote. As inflation developed and progressed, Social Security benefits were increased not only in proportion but much more. The typical ploy was to load up benefits in the present and push costs into the future, yet that future always arrived, and each few years later Congress would again have to increase payroll taxes levied on both workers and employers. Okay, and like I said, this is just, yet again another example of a small group selling the whole group, that is the whole country, all the other groups also, basically all the other groups mainly, down the river to benefit themselves. That's what the old people have been doing, not just the boomers, but, the other generations before them too. They were all selling everybody down the river. So, the boomers are selling us down the river. We're selling future generations down the river by not overthrowing the government. The generations before the boomers sold the boomers down the river, and the generation before them sold, the boomers' father's generation down the river. So everybody's just selling each generation down the river, and thus standard of living gets worse and worse and worse. Because they're all like, well, no, I want my Social Security. I paid in. I'm not going to, have it abolished because it's making because it's, getting robbed and it makes no sense anymore and it's being run retardedly and unfairly and being thieved from and all the rest of it. No, I want my money. I'm not going to take the loss, and then they're like, let the next generation, do it or whatever. But they've been paying in the whole time to pay the other people. So by the time they retire, they're like, I want my money. I'm not letting my life savings paying into Social Security be for nothing. I'm collecting. Fuck them. Let the next generation deal with it. And every generation says that. And then the problem just gets worse and worse. Everybody gets poorer. And then the government just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And the standard of living goes down for everybody. Generation after generation after generation. And then he says on the very last page that I want to read, the outlook is dark, but is not entirely without hope. Here and there one can detect a break in the clouds. More and more people are becoming aware the government has nothing to give them without first taking it away from somebody else, which is something I've said in previous videos, even without having read this, or from themselves, right? Like, government either has to steal from another country or from its own citizens to get any money at all, which it then can give you back. Right, acting like it's being generous when it stole it from either you or someone overseas in the first place. So it's ridiculous to act like government can give you anything. It can't. It has nothing other than what it first steals. Increased handouts to selected groups mean merely increased taxes, or increased deficits and increased inflation. And inflation is just a hidden tax. And inflation in the end misdirects and disorganizes production. Even a few politicians are beginning to recognize this, and some of them even state it clearly. In addition, there are marked signs of a shift in the intellectual winds of doctrine. Keynesians and New Dealers seem to be in a slow retreat. Conservatives, libertarians, and other defenders of free enterprise are becoming more outspoken and more articulate, and there are many more of them. Among the young, there is a rapid growth of a disciplined school of Austrian economists. There is a real promise that public policy may be There's a real promise that public policy may be reversed before the damage from existing measures and trends has become irreparable. Okay, but he was saying that back in the 60s or 70s. And look how much longer it's been. It's like what? Like, I don't know, it's probably about 50 years since he said that, right? And nothing is better. We're still saying, well, Trump got elected. There's signs of progress. We can still turn this thing around, blah, blah, blah. No, we can't. It's not going to happen. Either form a commune, a no-go zone, or a new country, or violently overthrow the government. Start a civil or a revolutionary war. That is the only way things are going to get better. And the only reason he was talking about that at the end, saying that things seem to be getting better, people seem to be waking up, the Keynesians are in retreat, etc., is because we had massive inflation in the 70s. People were forced to suffer, and that suffering forced them to red pill themselves, wake up, stop being short-sighted, stop being selfish, etc. And that is why sanity was beginning to return, because of suffering. Suffering in the form of very high inflation in the 70s, which America suffered, was starting to wake people up. But again, the only reason people were even starting to wake up and voted for Trump, therefore, was because they were suffering. Only when people suffer do they wake up and then start teaching true things. Do they red pill themselves? Do they become interested in truth, stop being apathetic, etc.? So we need to make the country suffer. And what are sprees done by people like Alec Manasseh and Elliot Rodgers, Nassim Aghdam, Brenton Tarrant, etc.? What are sprees but forcing the public to suffer? So these people actually make the public suffer and are doing their part and are therefore doing a very good and important thing, because nobody else is going to make the public suffer until we have an utterly horrific collapse. And then a horrific collapse will, make people suffer so much, it could actually kill millions or tens of millions, even maybe hundreds of millions of people. So, what's more moral? Taking out a few people to make the public suffer, and if everybody did that, there would be enough suffering. All it would need would be there to be just a few thousand sprees every year, and that would wake people up way more than enough to where they would red pill themselves and then become Austrian economists, stop supporting government, start, saving and sound money, etc. That would force a return to, a massively higher price for gold and silver. Everybody would see the dollar is BS and the gold and silver are real money. The government would be forced to shrink because it would no longer be able to steal through inflation because everybody is saving and sound money instead of saving in dollars in a bank or something. And then everything starts to get better. People only wake up when there's suffering, and you cannot assume that the public's going to wake up and therefore you're justified in being cowardly and not overthrowing the government because, there's positive signs, things are getting better. No, that was the way it was in the 50s, and they managed to find a way to kick the can down the road another 50. Back in the 70s, that's how it was. But, they managed to find a way to kick the can another 50 years by instituting the petrodollar. So things are not going to get better without using force. And at the very least, you need to use, force in the most humane, wise way possible by forming a commune, which keeps the cops out with violence, or forming a no-go zone, or forming your own new country. That is the only way to do it. Everybody should be deciding, like which state in the U.S. we're all going to move to, all of us conservatives, the ANCAPs, libertarians, and the hardcore conservatives. Which state are we going to move to so we massively displace all the liberals? And then, when there's 9 out of us, 9 of us for every 1 of them in that state, we can all start using physical violence to just get them to leave. Not even like using lethal violence. I'm just talking like, if you slap a liberal in the face every time you see him on the street, because there's 10 times as many conservatives in your state as there are liberals, and all you conservatives are hardcore conservatives who don't believe in police, so the police can't enforce the laws either, because if they do, 10 or 100 citizens will swarm around the cops, and they'll force the cops to not arrest the guy. Then everybody could just slap a liberal in the face every time they see one, and the liberals would be getting slapped in the face 30, 40 times a day. And then all the liberals would want to move out of the state, and then that state would be only conservatives, only ANCAPs, libertarians, and hardcore conservatives, and then they could declare that a new country. And that is what they should do. And that is what we seriously need to do. That is not a theoretical idea. We can absolutely do that. We just need to have just the tiniest little bit of courage and the tiniest little bit of organization to make it happen. That's about all I had to say in this video. This has been Redshift. Hopefully someone liked it. Hit thumbs up, thumbs down. Peace trucks.